Good morning, readers. It's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and welcome to another Bookish breakfast. So I've just done 3 weeks in a row of night shifts, starting my nights on Thursdays. So I'm on a day shift today, and waking up at 5 o'clock has been a little bit of a shock to the system. I'm not letting go of my dressing gown. It's way too cold, and also it is. I have less time this morning because I'm going to have to go and get the bus and go to work and do all that stuff. But anyway, I thought I'd just do a little check-in of my reading. So it's still non-fiction November, so things that I've been reading this month. I have been reading not a book, but a collection of non-fiction writing. I'm calling it non-fiction at least. Although some of it these days, you do have to question. I'm reading The Economist. So this is about 2 weeks old. This is the edition that came out just after Boris called the election. You can see this great caricature of Boris with his thumb on the election button. So I generally get my news from The Guardian, and I generally read The Guardian articles on my phone, like on the bus, or when I'm just wasting time on my phone, basically. But the problem with that is my politics and The Guardian's politics overlap very significantly, and I don't really tend to get my views challenged, and I tend to feel like whatever story they're spinning it the way that I would want it to be spun. So coming up for the election, it does make sense to try and read some different kinds of media, and I do quite like The Economist because I don't necessarily agree with what they say, but the reporting is really always of quite a high quality, and whenever you read an article, you feel like you have got the relevant information from it, and then you can see the bits that are fact and the bits that are opinion. I might be wrong, obviously. Journalists are very good at making facts tie into opinions, but I always feel like if I read an article in The Economist, then I can formulate my own response to what has been said there, whereas if I read an article in The Guardian, it already is my opinion, so it doesn't really challenge me to change anything. And the other thing I really like about The Economist is it's got quite a global scope, so it does have quite a few articles sort of discussing issues coming up to the election here, but it also has like some things about the fall of the Berlin Wall that I never would have thought about otherwise, necessarily. Like I might have seen a couple of articles about it, but it really kind of tries to unpick like East and West Germany divisions, which is not a topic that I would really have covered, even though I've got a friend who lives in East Germany who is from West Germany, and she's talked about it. But the kind of the depth that they went into in the article I did appreciate. And it does have obviously articles about economics. They're not my favourite ones, but it kind of pushes me to think about things that I otherwise wouldn't think about. So that's been enjoyable. That came out on the 2nd of November. So I might get another one just before the election, just to have the last minute thing. But it does take me. I can't read this in a week, even though it's tiny. I just can't get through that kind of technical density of reporting when I'm just reading it over breakfast. So yeah, so that's a non-fiction thing that I've read. I would say that I don't think it fits a prompt for non-fiction November. I'm hoping there'll be some kind of article about something that I can relate to sport, though, because that is the one prompt that I've not managed to meet. And I feel like an article could meet one of the prompts. I don't know. So the book that I've been mainly reading, the actual paper book, is what I'm referring to in my essay as Betts and Collier 2017. So that's Refuge, Transforming a Broken Refugee System. And I'm going to count this for the design prompt of Nonfiction November. I don't know whether I'm going to finish it. I don't know if you can see, I'm less than halfway through. Interestingly, so the picture on the cover is this very iconic picture of the what has been called the European migrant crisis. You can argue with that name, you certainly can, but the iconic image is of people in a boat, just due to the huge and appalling number of deaths that have occurred as a result of Europe's border policing policies. And then I realised that my bookmark for it is from the Book of Dust, so it's actually also people in a boat, although obviously in a fictional world. So what is there to say about Refuge? So this is a very interesting book. It's very technical compared to other books I've read on refugees and migrants this year. This is the only paper book. I've read a lot of articles, but this is the only paper book that is definitely academic. And you can tell that it's academic because every chapter kind of repeats their key points, because they're expecting some student to just pick it up and only read one chapter, or some, I don't know, policymaker to just come and read the most relevant chapter. So it more lends itself to somebody dipping into the bit that's most relevant to them. Although it does, like, each chapter does build on things that have gone before or refer to the things that come later. It doesn't feel like they think their principal audience is going to read it cover to cover. And it does go into things in a great deal of, like, detail, and it's very fact-based, which I do appreciate. So I'm counting this for the design prompt. I don't know whether I said that, because it says transforming a broken refugee system, and I think the idea is when it gets to the end of the book, it's going to make some recommendations for, like, improvements that could be made, whether or not they will be made. One thing that I found really good about this book, sorry, I'm just holding it up, like, way outside of the space for you to see it. One thing that I found really good is it has answered a lot of questions for me in terms of why our asylum system functions the way that it does function. And, like, the idea that we have international standards for who qualifies as a refugee, and the 1951 convention and so on. This book really goes in and, like, breaks down why there is not a universal principle, why every country has been able to kind of set their own standards and engage in this kind of, like, race to the bottom, where everyone is trying to encourage refugees and asylum seekers to seek asylum elsewhere. So people, states, particularly wealthy states, have tried to adjust and restrict and just tinker with their asylum laws to encourage people to go elsewhere, and kind of, like, left the burden on host countries that are not necessarily able to avoid the burden in the way that we unfortunately can. This is something that I don't really agree with. So my problem with this book is that I think the authors have an attitude problem, not as in they're sassy, but as in they don't seem to have made an effort to think about their perspective, and how that perspective is colouring their approach. So it bothers me, it does bother me in a book where there is a heavy overuse of militaristic metaphors. Like, I like colourful language, and I like an academic text that uses metaphors, because it makes it more readable, it makes it more enjoyable. But when the majority of those metaphors are based on war, even though, like, obviously some of the topics covered in talking about refugees do relate to war, but, like, relating back to, I'm trying to think, like, describing policies as, like, the actions of a general or something like that. Yeah, it makes me slightly uncomfortable. Then one example is, I think they kind of have a tiny bit of an ableist attitude, like, not an overt ableist attitude, but again with the metaphors, like, if you describe something once as sclerotic, that is just using colourful language, that's okay, as long as there's not somebody who's being specifically offended by that. But if you're repeatedly using that kind of metaphor where words related to like mobility issues or like issues of being able to physically do something, like then that becomes slightly, it does seem slightly ableist, and I feel like that could have been avoided without reducing the interest of the vocabulary. I think there are other words that you could use that would imply that the system is not functioning smoothly, without being potentially a little bit offensive to people who have got specific disorders that they use as their kind of descriptive words. And then the other thing, it came up in like, just in the introduction, I don't want to be mean to them, but there was one thing when they were talking about, they were invited to go to Jordan to try and like come up with a solution to this camp issue. And they go to this camp and they find a lot of people who are without work, and then they go next door to the camp and they find a lot of businesses that are without people to work there, and they're like, oh, 2 Oxford academics were able to add 2 and 2 together and make 4, and they were like, oh, we can just take people from there who don't have work and put them to work in this place where they need people to work. Okay, that's fair enough. That is a good solution, but to assume that you are the only people who have been able to come up with that solution, it doesn't take into account the inherent, like the privilege that they have as 2 people who have been invited over by the king from Oxford to kind of like to address the problem. Like any number of people living in that camp could have had that same solution. Any number of people in that business place who didn't have enough people to work could have come up with that solution, but they would not have necessarily been listened to. So I think to go in and say it like everybody in the area has been an idiot to miss this solution is very belittling to the people who might have, whether they were in the area but weren't given the opportunity to come up with that solution because they weren't allowed out of the camp to know where there was somewhere where there might be a business opportunity, or whether they might have had that idea but they just frankly wouldn't have been able to put it into action. And it just, like, they just take advantage of the fact that they have that agency and they are given that power of being able to direct solutions, whereas people around them might not necessarily be in that position. So that upset me, like, right from the start. And I really don't like to dismiss somebody. Sorry, I know I'm moving around a lot. I just didn't want to take the effort to put the tripod up. So yeah, sorry about that. I don't like to like group people by a category and dismiss people by a category, but I think it is kind of the problem of asking for solutions to these systems from, you know, rich old white men. And that is not to say that they don't have really, really valuable solutions to offer, but if they could do it in a way that didn't assume that everybody else had no contribution to make, that would be 10 times better. So yeah, so that was Betts and Collier, Refuge, Transforming a Broken Refugee System. So, speaking of rich old white men with a connection to Oxford, the other book that I've been reading is The Two Towers. I really love the cover of this. It's just, I just love it. Anyway, and I've been listening to it on audiobook, which I mentioned the last couple of weeks. So I think it's narrated by Rob Inglis, and I am in The Two Towers. So I have been really, really enjoying it. How long have I got? I don't really have that long. I'll try and like go through it quite quickly. So this is a reread for me, and I think it's the 3rd time that I've read it. I can't remember how far I got through it the first time I read it, but I think pretty much overall it's my 3rd read through of the series. And it's one of my favourite books. And I always say, like, one of the criteria for making a favourite book is that when you are rereading it, it reveals more depth and you get more out of it. And I definitely am getting more out of it. And one of the things I'm really enjoying this time reading The Two Towers, I've just met Faramir for the first time. I really love the portrayal of his grief and his bereavement. I'm not going to tell you why he's bereaved, but you know, if you know the story, the way that he's got like the disbelief, the way that he's got all of these questions that he really desperately wants to be answered. I just found it really like emotional and believable, and I always love the character of Gollum and just the nuances there. That's really enjoyable. But the other thing that you get from rereading sometimes is problems, and I don't know why my head at the moment is just like on the lookout for problems with things that people have written. But yeah, the first time I read it, I felt like there were some problems because there was a massive lack of women, and I was like maybe 12 years old, and I was really disappointed because in the films, at least, Arwen like gets to ride with Frodo on a horse or whatever, and that doesn't even happen in the book. And yes, like Eowyn is one of my favourite characters in fantasy, and she is absolutely badass. She is awesome, but she alone cannot make up for the complete lack of women elsewhere. So that upset me the first read through. I've come to terms with that. That's okay. Like, it's not the book that I turn to for strong female characters, apart from Eowyn. On the second read through, I suddenly became aware of the amount of class that there is in Lord of the Rings and the kind of dynamics that you have related to class and hierarchy and subservience, particularly between Frodo and Sam, but also between somebody like Aragorn and Boromir or something like that, where you've got this kind of like very strict structure of who is important compared to who, which was something that I didn't notice on the first read through. now on the third reading, and I've definitely heard people say this before, but I've never, like, I hadn't seen it, so I kind of thought, oh, it's not really there. But I'm just getting a huge amount of racism. It's really, really quite strong. And I don't know whether it's reading it aloud has kind of drawn my attention to, like, phrases like dark-skinned that maybe if I was reading it in the book, I would just skim read it. But because somebody's telling it to me, then it jars in the listening. And there's this kind of like overarching thing through the book that not necessarily, like, evil isn't necessarily, how can I say this? So in my notes I've written, evil isn't necessarily ugly, but ugly is evil. And I realised that could come across badly as well. What I mean by that is, like, the orcs are very, very vividly described as being bad and, you know, like, bad to look at and bad to speak to. Yeah, I'm getting lost here. But then also, it's like, evil isn't necessarily black, but black is necessarily evil in the way that Tolkien has written it. So there are characters with depth and complexity, and there are characters who are traitors, and characters with redemption arcs, and characters who are, you're in doubt as to whether they are good or evil. But all of those characters, that was a very weird way of saying evil, all of those characters that have depth and doubt over their moral character are all white. So if you're white, you get the opportunity to be either good or evil, or potentially have some grey areas. If you are black, then you are one of the men of the South who is flooding into Mordor, and you are just an ally of Sauron, and there is no other option for you within the story. There are no, that I've come across so far, there are no characters who are described as darker skinned who are given the opportunity to be on the good side. There is one moment in The Two Towers that I've just heard recently, where Sam looks at a man from the South who has recently been killed, and it very vividly describes, like, you can't make any mistakes as to where, like, what kind of racial identity he's supposed to have. It talks about, like, his braided hair and, you know, the like, even like his hands and so on, like the way that it's described, it's very clear what he's supposed to look like. And Sam looks at him and he thinks, oh, he wonders whether he was really evil or whether it was just like his leaders sent him to war. And that is the only moment when we are allowed any doubt as to whether or not this man is a goodie or a baddie. Other than that, it's just like blanket. Everyone who has darker skin is evil, and the orcs as well are explicitly described as having darker skin. And that is also tied up with ideas of their, like, intellect as well. So it's quite insidious and a little bit unpleasant the way that is done. So the problem for me is not about in writing about white characters and having all of the main characters as white characters. That's okay because it's natural to write about what you know. And maybe I would feel differently if I, like, was looking for representation for myself, like I did with the women. Maybe I would feel differently, but I don't think it's bad to write from the perspective that you are living. So I don't think it's bad for all of Tolkien's main characters to be described as, like, pale-skinned and fair and tall and grey eyes and all of this. That's okay, but what the problem is when all of the enemy look completely different and look a different racial identity. I think that is very problematic, and it doesn't make me dislike the books. It just makes me feel a little bit unhappy that Tolkien would do that. So yeah, so those are my thoughts, and just let me know if you have any thoughts too on any of the things that I've talked about. I hope you have a lovely day, and I had better dash and get my bus. Okay, take care.